With the backing of whom?
With the backing of CIA, of course. The organization you wanted to join back in the day, as I understand. We should thank God they didn't let you in. Although, it is a serious organization. I understand.
One of our senior United States senators from the state of New York, Chuck Schumer, said yesterday, I believe, that we have to continue to fund the Ukrainian effort, or U.S. soldiers, citizens could wind up fighting there. How do you assess that?
Well, if somebody has the desire to send regular troops, that would certainly bring humanity to the brink of very serious global conflict. This is obvious. Do the United States need this? What for? Thousands of miles away from your national territory. Don't you have anything better to do? You have issues on the border, issues with migration, issues with the national debt. More than $33 trillion. You have nothing better to do, so you should fight in Ukraine? Wouldn't it be better to negotiate with Russia? Make an agreement, already understanding the situation that is developing today, realizing that Russia will fight for its interests to the end?
John Doyle in. Heck off, commie.
Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Heck Off Commie. Welcome to Big Announcement Week. As you know, Tucker Carlson was just in Moscow to interview Russian President Vladimir Putin. It's the first interview I think that Putin's done since the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict 2 years ago. And already following the interview, which was over 2 hours long, it got hundreds of millions of views. Western media is assuring that still there's no possibility for peace talks with Russia. Joe Biden's White House is tweeting out more of these vague platitudes about why it's important still to keep funding Ukraine. And there were, of course, calls from the EU to sanction Tucker Carlson. So broadly speaking, people were not happy about this interview. And then it happened. And then more people on our side were trying to find reasons to be unhappy about it. And that's always going to happen. You know, with any piece of content that blows up, especially one that's important for us, people are going to have to find something wrong with it, because a lot of people don't actually care. They don't actually have beliefs. They just want to be the contrarian. Like, that's the extent of their involvement. You're going to meet people like that in life, but criticism just to criticize without substance, it's almost always vanity. Like, it doesn't have to be elaborate. It doesn't have to be substantive. It's just about posturing, is having this heightened perception of the situation. Well, I'm the one who really understands what's going on, and this actually sucked. It was actually pretty good. So we're going to go through 5 of the biggest takeaways from this interview, which nobody else, by the way, understood. I was the only one who understood this. So by extension, you will understand this. But if you want to know really some of the background of this whole issue, you can go back and watch the video that we did 2 years ago when we were the only people who understood it then. A lot of very important material, which is aged very well. And I'll just say, I'm happy. In the years since it's been posted, more people have started to see things our way. That's good news. By the way, last thing, I'll say this before we jump in. You have to be able to consume a piece of media without spurging out in either direction. You can understand Russia's position. You can respect Vladimir Putin. Doesn't mean you should start unironically buying into like the based Putin memes. Based Putin, like it's funny. It's closer to being true than it is not true. But you have to understand, Putin, as he even alludes to in this interview, he doesn't view himself as being at the helm of some ideological conflict against the liberal West, as the avatar of some trad world order. He doesn't even think he needs to go that far. He basically understands that his job is just to run the country and deal with the nagging and the aggravation from Western countries, like as a part of that job description. But he presents as very reasonable, and it's hard to take issue with a lot of what he says, but there is a faction of people on the right who want to meme him into being this based figure who's going to come save us. And I guess people have grouped me into that to an extent as well because of what I've said about Russia in the past, all of which I stand by. So let me just clarify. I fully understand that the right is so desperate for heroes that it's going to quickly and immediately latch on to anybody that says anything even remotely in contrast to what we're used to dealing with here in America every day, especially someone as powerful as Vladimir Putin. It does not mean that they're our guy necessarily, much less that they're going to be of any help to us. So if you want to spend your energy on that, that's your prerogative. Go for it. Certainly there are things that we can learn from Putin, as there are with any serious serious world leader, but don't let that evolve into something delusional. Like when I came out 2 years ago with my dissertation on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which was at a time when it wasn't popular to question U.S. involvement in the war and question support for Ukraine, let alone to say that Russia's actions were actually understandable and maybe even justified, though thankfully over the years the mainstream position has largely come around to those conclusions, even if the swamp elders are still going to keep funneling money into this conflict. But I said, Putin's not really a problem for us. Our problems are right here. And if our empire seeks to impose evil and absurdity onto the rest of the world, maybe it's beneficial for us in the long run for the world order to become multipolar, for our influence to diminish, for pressure to be put onto our systems, our elites to be replaced, and for us to actually have, once again, a vehicle to advance the interests of the American people as opposed to whatever this is. Also, Putin makes everybody who's running stuff cry. And yeah, I derive a sense of joy from that, so fine, no problem. I'll make some memes about Putin. But then I've got people yelling at me, well, look at the rates of drug use and abortion and STIs. A lot of that can be explained by the fact that Russia was a collapsed empire. When that happens, when your empire collapses, you're going to see a lot of whiplash, self-destruction throughout your population. But as Russia's sort of gotten back on its feet, a lot of that has decreased. But what I'm concerned about with Russia is they don't force what's evil and backwards upon their people like the West does. There's not this top-down effort from the Russian government to do that like there is here. Russia was enacting laws 10 years ago to ban LGBT propaganda from being shown to minors, which of course America threw a big fit about, called Russia evil and authoritarian and oppressive. That was over 10 years ago. That was before we decided over here that there's actually a constitutional right to marry a dude back in 2015. Look at how everything has accelerated since then. So clearly, Russia is aware of which way the wind is blowing and how these things tend to spread if they're not contained. And all of this is just to say that you don't have to buy into the Putin is Hitler sentiment, and you don't have to even buy into the watered down version of it, which is still popular on the right for some reason. Putin's this evil authoritarian dictator. You also, though, don't have to lionize him. You can just recognize him and respect him as an intelligent, competent, serious leader, but he's not your dad. He doesn't care about you. Don't get your hopes up. He's not coming to save us. We're like orphans on the right. You know, are you my dad? Are you going to save me, Mr. Putin? Can I come home with you? It's not going to happen. But once it was announced that Tucker was in Moscow, people started freaking out about the potential for this interview. They were calling on the EU to sanction him. People were calling for him to be arrested and charged with treason. And the reason they were so worried about this interview taking place, as I saw on Twitter before it aired, it's not so much because they were worried about narrative control. That's what people were saying. That was the common line. Oh, they're losing the narrative. No, they're not. No, they're going to hold on to that one just fine, at least for the time being. And Putin says as much later on, that it's impossible to win a propaganda war with the United States because they control the globalized media, largely to the benefit of their financial institutions. But the reason that people were freaking out and panicking about this interview is because it was going to show Americans for the first time what a statesman is. And the American political class cannot have that because they demand to be taken seriously, because all they have is perceived legitimacy. In reality, they're nothing more than theater kids. They're just LARPing their little West Wing fantasy, their little Veep fantasy. They're not real elites, and so they require to be taken seriously. Whereas Putin does the interview, he doesn't care if he's taken seriously or not. He knows he's that guy. He's got the power. Whereas American political figures, they're not, because they know that they hold power illegitimately. And this is why I always give the example of the power behind my good friend Alex Stein playfully sexually harassing AOC on the steps of the United States Capitol. She got so mad at that because it's to say, look, I know you've got your little congresswoman outfit. I know you've got your little takes and your little binders and it's all color coordinated. But to me, you're always just going to be a big booty Latina. It melts away the self-perception of the girl boss, of the theater kid. Whereas if you call her an idiot socialist, you're a communist. That's something you say to an actual political figure that you view as a threat. So they actually like that because they don't care about anything other than that fake status, appearing elites, playing the role of a political actor because it's all insecure. They know it's illegitimate. So it's not about narrative control or whatever. It's about the American political class being absolutely embarrassed by a Slavic autist going on with no notes for 2 hours about 9th century Russian history, citing obscure economic statistics from all these different countries, name-dropping diplomats and minor European politicians who've been dead for like 50 years. Yeah, the guy's just on a totally different level. And that's what they can't stand because they need to be taken seriously above all else, which is why they put you in jail for shitposting, why they pretend to be the expert consensus on everything. Why they always defer to their fake credentials. They have to force you to take them seriously because no one would ever do so naturally because they're this like ridiculous assembly of people. I mean, look at how they send their top guy, Joe Biden, out there after this interview to try to beat the retard allegations. Like, he's going on about how he remembers his son every day. He invokes a rosary that his son gave him, but then he can't remember the name, and he just says, Our Lady of, and he just kind of stops. It's painful to watch. And it's very funny, too, how the serious person responds to this, like the smart thing to say when you have a senile president is, we need presidential age limits because for whatever reason, democracies can't be trusted to simply not elect a literal vegetable because you're not going to beat the U.S. in a propaganda war, right? Speaking of propaganda, this kind of relates. Please give me 30 seconds to remind you that crime and violence are problems that have been solved by us before. They figured it out last year in El Salvador, but in our country, these problems have been reintroduced by choice because the regime enjoys having these asymmetrical gangs of golems roaming around, terrorizing normal Americans and their families, threatening their lives, the lives of those they care about. So you need to be prepared. For what, you ask? I'm so glad you asked, actually. You need to be prepared to be judged by 12 because that beats being carried by 6. What do you think is going to happen when the grid falls, when food runs out? That's why you need to get the iTarget cubes today. You need to get the training system. You need to develop proficient marksmanship. You need to develop muscle memory. You need to be able to defend yourself and defend your family and your friends. So you save 20% on the iTarget cubes, plus you get free shipping with the offer code Doyle20 at checkout. Just go to itargetpro.com. That's the letter I. Targetpro.com comes in all major calibers from 9mm to .223. You can train with almost any firearm and is the easiest, the most cost-effective way to train, and it pays for itself in literally one day. These people are in full panic mode. There's no telling how crazy things might get. Don't wait. Prepare with iTarget. They think they're General Sherman. They hate you. You need to be prepared. Go to the website. That's the letter itargetpro.com. Offer code Doyle20. Very epic. We continue onto our list. The biggest takeaways, the biggest moments, whatever, from the interview. What you need to know. Number 1, very important. Vladimir Putin has autism. This was a very important lesson for the right about history. So this was released at like 6 p.m. Eastern time. I started watching it a little bit afterwards. It starts with Tucker asking Putin the big question. Why did he choose to launch this military operation 2 years ago? Vladimir Putin tells Tucker he's going to take 30 seconds, maybe a minute, to explain the history behind the conflict before answering that question. Tucker says, please, yeah, proceed. So Putin starts reciting 9th century Russian history. This goes on for several minutes before Tucker interrupts. He's asking him what this has to do with the question. Putin says he's going to get there, so he keeps going. And I tweeted out when I saw this, like, oh, dude, poor Tucker. He knows that Americans have been made literally too retarded to listen to a well thought out historical justification for a military operation. So he feels compelled to, hurry it along to disarm any potential backlash. Like, he's letting him own the interview. So Putin keeps going on. Tucker has this twinkle in his eye. And so I said something like, he seems to be genuinely endeared by listening to an intelligent leader. Like, you can just see this on his face. He's really enjoying it. And I was wondering, like, if he's got these visions of other American politicians he's spoken to playing in his head. But it keeps going. And this goes on for like 40 minutes of just history. So I'd recommend watching this at some point if you haven't already. It's not the most entertaining thing in the world. If you're looking for entertainment, the highlights to me were when Tucker Carlson, like a true frat boy, called Russian President Vladimir Putin clearly bitter. And then when Putin also implied that Adolf Hitler did not actually die in Berlin in 1945. But what happened here is that Putin shoots right away, right off the bat. He's throwing Tucker off balance. He's wasting his time because he says, if you don't mind, I'm going to speak for 30 seconds, maybe a minute tops. And then he speaks for like 10 minutes before Tucker Carlson finally interrupts. But it just keeps going like this. And if you're Tucker, there's literally nothing you can really do in this situation. Like, you can try to interject like he did several times, but Putin's going to continue to make the case that he's making because he keeps insisting that it's important to answer the question that you, Tucker Carlson, asked him initially in his house, in his country. And every time you try to take back control of the conversation, Putin takes a shot at your professionalism, at your competence, at your intelligence. He's like, don't you have a degree in history? Are we going to have a serious conversation, or is this some sort of talk show? And you can't make him angry, because if you blow an interview this big, which people are already talking about, people are already waiting for and expecting, how do you come back for that? It's literally over for you. You should just kill yourself. So it seems like he was totally caught off guard by it, which is interesting because I'm sure he did his homework on this beforehand, as of course he would before anything that's important, but Putin has been known to do things like this. And Eastern Europeans in general, they have a reputation for doing things like this. Now, at the beginning, he does mention 2 reasons why he did launch this military operation, being, of course, the history, but also the aggression from NATO against Russia. And he claims that this particular conflict actually started back in 2014 with the US-backed coup in Ukraine, followed by the massacres which were perpetrated by the neo-Nazi militias. But people don't know that. They don't even know like the recent history behind this conflict. And so, yeah, it seems like one day this guy woke up and decided to like freaking invade a sovereign nation because he's an evil bad guy. That's why people were watching this and they're like, I'm lost. Like, when are you going to tell us who the evil bad guy is? When do we get to know who the freaking bad guy is? Because that's how we're taught to view military conflicts in the West. You go from peace to an evil freaking bad guy trying to freaking take over the world. And obviously there's always more to it. I mean, 80% of a fight is knowing when you're in a fight. Bystanders will say, wow, we just hit that guy for no reason. No, the fight started a while ago. Maybe that was the first strike. Maybe that was the first thing you saw. But the fight's been going on for a while. So there's the historical claim to the land, but also the fact that the land has been used as a proxy for NATO aggression, which is sort of tradition. There's sort of a pattern there because there's a history of Ukraine, which literally means borderland, the borderland between Russia and Europe, being used by the West to weaken Russia. Like he mentions the concept of Ukrainian nationalism being propagated by, I believe, German intelligence to contribute to destabilizing Russia, thereby weakening a potential adversary in World War I. So when Tucker does interrupt him for the first time after like 13 minutes, he's like, okay, so you're making a case that there's a historic claim to the land. Well, why not just take it when you become president 24 years ago? Why wait until 2 years ago? And Putin says, well, I'm getting there. But that question is key, which we're about to answer. But Putin goes on to mention how Russia had poured significant resources into developing Ukraine. Those are then dragged away when the USSR collapses in 1991. It was all for nothing. And also how former Russian leadership believed that as the USSR had ceased to exist, that ideological lines were now dissolved, that would provide opportunity for international cooperation between Russia and the West. But that would have to mean that NATO could not advance eastward, because then things would pretty much just be the same as they were during the Cold War. And he references some politicians who had predicted this at the time, that things were going to end up happening just the way that they have if they weren't listened to. And he says that they've been completely vindicated. He also mentions for the millionth time that he has no ambitions past Ukraine, which is a point that Western leaders continue to lie about to justify continuing to spend money and lives on this conflict, because it's actually about an evil bad guy taking over the world. And again, we've covered the relevant history about this conflict when it really popped off like 2 years ago. So you should go watch that video if you haven't. But the answer to Tucker's question isn't actually because of some historical claim. I'm sure Putin does feel that way. And as he mentions, a lot of Russians and even Ukrainians feel that way as well. But the history lecture was not to answer the question. That's a cultural flex. That's a power move, and it worked. But the truth is that actually, the reason doesn't have to be complicated. Like, you can literally just do whatever you want. Well, you can't invade a sovereign nation. Yeah, you can. You can do whatever you want. You think you're the first country to get invaded? Greater countries than yours have been invaded for dumber reasons throughout history. I promise you that. And history is very important to Slavs, so this presents very well to a Russian audience. Because think about it. The Russian audience doesn't want to think that this whole military operation is just because of NATO. That almost puts them on the defense, right? That's not inspiring. That's not good messaging. That's not good propaganda. They want to believe that they are fighting to fulfill their legacy and their heritage, to take back from NATO what was theirs for 1,000 years. And of course, they're aware of the threat from NATO. They're aware of the aggression. They want to defend their homeland, but it presents a stronger and a more inspiring case to frame it as this inevitable historical reunification that was merely disrupted by illegitimate Western aggression. And so Putin forces Tucker to go through this with him, and he forces us to as well. And a lot of people were really bored, which is totally understandable. I don't know why, though, people are so enthusiastic to betray their own stupidity. Like, they're just shouting from the rooftops, this interview's boring. What is bro yapping about? Like, yeah, you know, it's a 2-hour interview about a geopolitical issue. Like, do you need GTA driving footage juxtaposed on the screen? Why don't you go back to MSNBC, where they will explain things to you in terms of Harry Potter characters? Thanks for telling us you have high time preference. I sort of assumed when you spoke in Ebonics, but I appreciate that you clarified for us. Why do people post their own L's like that? Like, if you're in a sphere where ostensibly you're going to consume content that's relatively important and dense, why are you just advertising that you're on like a different frequency? Like, go watch Mr. Beast or something. But that's actually a good question. Who is this interview for? Who was this supposed to be for? Who did Vladimir Putin think he was speaking to? That's the big question, which we'll be discussing in a second. But the last thing about the history is that it stood out to everybody. I mean, the big takeaway for everyone was, wow, I mean, look at this compared to what our politicians could do. Joe Biden couldn't do that. And I'm sure part of the reason for that monologue was to elicit that reaction so that Russians could laugh at Americans realizing how outclassed we are. And this is just one of those things. I mean, you can go through the interviews that Western journalists did with different authors and political figures in Serbia and Croatia during the conflicts in Yugoslavia, and they're complaining about the same thing. Like, everything has to be a history lesson. This is just like Slavic autism trolling the punctual, impatient Anglo. But generally, the reactions seem to be good. Some people were seething about people saying they enjoyed it because they didn't actually understand it. And it's like, yeah, I mean, you know, it's not insight. It's not commentary. commentary. It's just historical narrative. And if you don't know 1,000 years of Russian history, then there's not a lot that you're going to be able to say about it, except for, okay, that was an impressive recitation. And I don't know a lot of 9th century Russian history. It's always been a blind spot of mine, but with the World War II stuff, some of it was a bit questionable. But what made it worse is that you had people who are supposed to be smart crying because Putin mentioned the importance of denazification in Ukraine. And people were like, what? Putin's just a libtard boomer? Yeah, very serious messaging. Thank you for that. People were getting mad at Putin for that segment on denazification, literally because they're low IQ. Like, you hear the word Nazi being used in conversation, and you assume it means the same thing as when Nancy Pelosi or Hassan Piker uses that word, like you're a dog. You hear a familiar word and you're like, cringe. Like, that's the level you're on. You must be made to understand. When Putin talks about Nazis, that's not the same thing as when libtards talk about Nazis. And Americans don't seem to understand that. Like, when people outside of the West use that word, that means something entirely different than when we use that word. Like, over there, a fascist and a Nazi is basically defined as anyone who sets themselves up to be an enemy of the Russian state. The people who killed 30 million of your people in less than a decade, they're pretty much always going to be like the permanent enemy. The enemies in the Great Patriotic War, as Putin mentions, that's how it's referred to in Russia. Those guys are going to be the enemy. That's just sort of how that works. It's not because of some secular stand-in for Satan. It's not because of freaking racism or Jews. It's because they denuded the Russian population and turned the Soviet state into a cripple. Like, even if Putin has said positive things about diversity before or whatever, the country's like 20% Muslim, what's he going to do? That's not the driving force behind hating Nazis. Moreover, when he mentions denazification in the clip that everybody's sharing around, but no one seems to understand, he explicitly defines denazification as an effort to diminish an independent Ukrainian identity, being an identity that is separate from the historical case that he spends 40 minutes laying out about the territory being a part of the Russian state, especially if that independent identity is one that is established through alignment with Russia's enemy and who they fought against in the Great Patriotic War, which cost 27 million Russian lives. Like, that's why he also mentions that the origins of Ukrainian nationalism as an idea were a foreign intelligence operation intended to weaken Russia as a potential opponent before the First World War. But people hear this and assume he's just playing like Nazi hot potato. He's just like Chuck Schumer. Has he not already demonstrated that he's above these American tactics? He views them as childish. Are you capable of inductive reasoning? Also, when he's delivering this interview, what do you want him to say? Like, he's fighting a war right now. He's sticking to his messaging. He's in propaganda mode. He's capable of far greater insight than what's displayed here, but that's not the purpose of the interview. We'll talk about that in a second, but I'd be interested to hear his like zoomed in perspective on the Second World War. Maybe someday we'll get that. And by the way, I'm not defending Putin in saying that Ukrainians were the real bad guys during the Second World War. I'm explaining the context of his position. But you also have to understand that when Ukrainians are working with the Germans in World War II, it's because they view them as a potential source for liberation from the communist oppression that they were experiencing from Moscow. So what's the answer there? I mean, like, what are they supposed to do in that situation? So still, when Putin's talking about problems with Ukrainian Nazis, what that boils down to is still just this conflict stemming from World War II. It's not like this romanticized moral indictment in the way that we would be used to in the West. And there were other incentives as well. I mean, Ukrainians did not exactly get along with Jews, to put it mildly. But then again, neither did the Russians. And so the biggest thing probably is that you're just going to want to fight against whoever intentionally starved your people to death in the Holodomor, which was an intentional genocide of European Christians, famine as a matter of policy by the Bolsheviks, which nobody talks about. We never learn about that. But Putin himself doesn't seem to be a friend of the Bolsheviks at all either. I mean, he seems to actually have this very personal beef with them. He takes several shots at them throughout the interview, basically calls Lenin a retard. They, of course, hijacked a Christian Russia, murdered Tsar Nicholas II and his entire family, and then would go on to kill tens of millions of Russians. So, understandable. It's a complicated situation. Is Putin right? Is Ukraine right? Good question. I don't know. That's not true. It's beyond the scope of our discussion today. The point is, he's not using like Nazi in the way that we understand it to be used in the West. So I don't know why people are crying about that, saying that he's on the level of like your typical Democrat politician or talking head. Maybe you learned about all this in school, you feel a certain way. Maybe you've read Sean McMeekin's work, you feel another way. The bottom line is that Putin's position is different and requires more context to fully understand. Like when Putin mentions that the guy who was applauded in the Canadian Parliament was former SS, that means that that guy literally participated in events that almost destroyed the Russian state. So it's a little bit different. What are you going to do? But people have like based themselves into developing their own strain of Putler derangement syndrome. That's their history. We need to understand ours, because there are a lot of things that in our history, if they are properly understood, it would make people more comfortable with what we want our future to look like. So like with anything else, what matters is right now. All we can control is where we are right now. But, we give ourselves more room to work with if we understand our history and where we came from. So the bottom line is that it's a good thing if the mainstream position following this interview is that we need to know who we are, we need to understand our history if we're going to survive and have a future. Because right now we obviously don't. And I don't mean that we don't understand like the founding orders of Connecticut. We don't know enough about the Albany Congress. Rather, our history has been held hostage for like a century now. The history that we do know, or rather that we're taught, it's like this hollow, wrong, ashamed, watered down history. And our current American historiography being a perpetual narrative of revolution, freedom from oppression against Britain, to West African slaves, to civil rights, to gay rights. That's bad, that's a lie, that's harmful. That is the history that justifies everything that has happened and that is going to happen. And the historiography, meaning, of course, the narrative of history, because that's always going to exist, anything that we've had or that we've offered as a counter to that, which we're now realizing has not been sufficient, it's not been strong enough, it's basically been the same thing except about freedom by itself. But freedom's a vacuum, right? It's a transitory state. Okay, freedom to do what? Freedom. Can I do butt stuff? Look, brother, I support your rights. Okay, thanks. And then, the West literally falls. And with that counter, if you want to call it that, I'm not going to pretend that I don't see the appeal there because it's obviously worked for a while. Americans really do seem to take a sense of pride in this, like, if you mess with me, I'll kill you. And then I'll light a firework and I'm going to smash a beer can on your head like Steve Austin. But obviously, the country's changing. We're becoming more diverse. We have people who don't understand, resonate, relate to history no matter how we present it to them. And if they do, it's only because they view themselves to be cast into the next act of liberating the poor oppressed people from the evil white men. And so it seems to be that as we're becoming more aware that this model of our history is not working, Americans are feeling this sense of anxiety, but they can't express it because they don't have the tools to do so. And so we have to be prepared to give them those tools, to present them with an actual history that they're starving for of their country. So insofar as this makes the American right more focused on its own history, that's good because it's all right there. The material's out there. And it is sobering to realize that our country is so young, but people can't even recall its history. Then you watch a guy recite more than 1,000 years of history in one monologue and you're like, damn. How could you not be impressed by that? And people were crying online because of that reaction, people being impressed by it. Well, they're just saying that, they didn't really understand it. It's like, this is like one of those kids at school who, they'd come up to you if you're wearing like a Nirvana t-shirt and they'd be like, hey, name 3 songs right now. What? I want to see if you really understand it the way I do, if you're just a fake fan. It's like, what are you doing right now? That's all it is. It's like complaining that people are posturing online about having an understanding of whatever Putin said. That's the gayer version of that. That's what they're doing, but gayer. It's like, I'm the one who really got it, and they don't. I'm the one who really understands it. Like, they're just pretending. It's like, yeah, do they understand the complexities of 9th century Russian history? Probably not. Who cares? Everyone watches the interview. They enjoy it. They conclude that we need to understand our history, we need a better understanding of it, and then you've got people over there just waving their hands in the sky. Wait, hey, over here, they don't actually understand it. Like, this guy went off for 40 minutes about the history of his country. Let him cook. It may have been scripted. Who cares? I don't doubt that he could present it if he had to, even if less polished, extemporaneously, assuming that wasn't already. And of course, not that everybody has to be on the level of like the head of a state, but to realize that we don't have anybody in this country who's even approximating that level, it's sobering. And it's important that we recognize that. So I don't understand this impulse. People have this impulse to always be contrarian, always want to wait to see what the majority is saying so they can say, well, actually, it's really like this. It's vanity. It's stupid. There's no coherence. There's no clarity to how they view the world. It's just like indefinite seething. And this is just how it works. Like, as things continue to decline in this country, the mainstream is going to naturally adjust and become more how we need it to be, because people's anxieties are going to give them permission to entertain ideas that otherwise they would have considered to be too taboo. And people just have to find a reason to have a problem with this. This is a good thing, but it's because that's what they've trained themselves to do, is just always be contrarian. It's like, can we just move the ball down the field? We have to just take this interview and get from it what we can. And if it made people more embarrassed because it made them cognizant of their own incomprehension of our history, that's a good thing. Well, we're sick of the past. We have to look forward. We have to be forward thinking and look at the future. I see people say this as if it's like this profound insight. Like, they're frustrated with how things are going. They're frustrated with the messaging. So they just vomit this out as a criticism, but then they offer no explanation as to what that would look like. It's just pontification. Well, this is what a serious person would say about politics. This is serious. We have to be we have to have a vision. Guys, Guys, coach is right. If we want to win, we have to be forward thinking. Okay, yeah, what's the idea? And it's just repackaged ideas, repackaged aesthetics, all just thrown together arbitrarily. And it's like, but maybe you like it because the shelf life is longer than whatever they're selling at Fox News. Like that product is stale now. And it's funny because one of the biggest problems with other right-wing movements that have failed is that they just repeat the same stupid mistakes because they don't know history. Maybe they were too busy, I don't know, with philosophy or something else. So of course, these people on Twitter, if they paid a little bit more attention to history, they would know that. So it's just this big cycle that we're living through. It's Groundhog Day. We're living in Groundhog Day. And like we've said before, all successful political movements do three things. They describe an ideal past, they identify a present enemy, and then they illustrate a better future. So it's like, hey, we had a good thing going, right? Now it sucks, and it's their fault. But thankfully, we can make it. I was going to say we can make America great again. We can make it great again. And they just swap out the inputs. But that's what all successful political movements do. And that's literally what Make America Great Again was. That's why it was successful. And you look at who has power now and is progressive and forward thinking and utopian and visionary as they are, they still understand that people look to the past just as much as they do the future. Look at Brandon's inaugural address. As progressive and far left as his administration is, as forward thinking as his administration is, their slogan in 2020 was literally, "Our best days still lie ahead." And in his inauguration speech, he goes on and on about all the historical grievances that will warrant and justify the actions of his administration. 400 years of slavery this, World War II, the real Antifa that, Martin Luther King this. So it's very much present, this history-seeking impulse within people. They want to mythologize themselves. They crave a mythology. And you might not like that, you might be bored of that, but it's not something that you can just abandon completely because what people believe about the future is largely informed by the past and their perception of that. So knowing the history is important, bringing attention to it's important. And this did bring attention to a big weakness that we have on the right and as a country. Does this mean that everybody's going to go to basedbooks.store and wake up? No. But people are talking about our lack of understanding more now than before, and that's good for us, bottom line. You need to read more history. Stop reading philosophy that you don't even understand. Stop reading this like mass market, self-help garbage. Postpone all of that. Put all of that on the back burner. When your libtard aunt asks you at Thanksgiving how you can still support Donald Trump after the January 6th insurrection, you need to be able to begin your answer with the Louisiana Purchase. At least go back to mid-5th century Britain being invaded by various Anglo-Saxon tribes now establishing what we understand to be the English common law tradition, and probably even farther back. Honestly, if you can't do that, everything else is deprioritized. You have to be history maxing. You need to be able to tie it all together. You need to be making people uncomfortable with your answers. You need to be inconsiderate to people's time, as if they have anything else more rewarding to be doing than listening to you explain to them how the world works. Punish them for their arrogance. Number two, peace in Ukraine? Real? True? A lot of people don't know that when the Russians pulled out of Kiev, it was because the West said that they would have to do that as a precondition for peace negotiations to take place. So Putin's like, okay, fair enough. How are they supposed to negotiate with a gun to their head? So they leave. And then the second they leave, the West just tears up all talks of peace. They have their media report it like Putler retreats, defeat imminent. So the point here is that this entire war is a creation of the United States. And knowing that is the purpose of this interview. Like everyone's trying to overcomplicate it. Everything about this interview, the format, it being granted to Tucker Carlson, the length, the information provided. Yeah, there's some meme questions. Oh, thoughts on AI? The purpose of the interview was to let the American public know that if this war is escalated further, it's not because of Russia. It's because of the American government. He's preventing the United States and NATO from basically being able to escalate the war in Eastern Europe without American citizens understanding that we're responsible. Was there any new information presented? Not really. Not if you've been following this conflict. But think about it. Who was this for? Well, who did Putin think he was talking to? Twitter. That's why it was given to Tucker Carlson. That's why he put the interview on Twitter. Because political discourse, the public square, even when it leaves Twitter, it's significantly influenced by Twitter. This interview is there. It got hundreds of millions of views. It's one of the most viewed pieces of political media maybe ever. And it's covered, of course, on every other network. The clips are being played. That's why it was Tucker. If he gave this interview to Fox News, Sean Hannity, it goes to the old media talking heads to cover. But beyond that, no one would really care. Tucker Carlson, though, he's one of the most popular figures on the American right, easily top 5. People cared because it was him. It flows downstream into coverage from the usual suspects from Tucker, but it would not have been this big if it weren't for Tucker. This was done to disseminate that information to people in a presentation with their favorite journalist, likely. It's done to further undermine the support for the war. Because remember, the mainstream position after years shifted from defend Ukraine to, well, we shouldn't be involved. But as it shifts from there to, well, actually, wait a minute, this was sort of our fault in the first place, that complicates things for the US and for NATO. That puts pressure on them. Because this information, while it was viewed by the masses of people, it was filtered through Tucker Carlson on Twitter, because those are people who actually have some pull. You know this if you're involved with politics at any level. Everyone is addicted to Twitter. Every person has a Twitter addiction. And this was essentially a dossier of information presented to those people, those relatively intelligent people, tens of millions of them who are working in politics. And I heard some people say, oh, this was a missed opportunity. It would have been better if Putin had come out and said, oh, well, there are no men playing in women's sports in Russia. Why? Like what? So he could pander to the lowest common denominator? So he could pander to people whose involvement in politics begins and ends at the ballot box? He doesn't need sympathy from the West. He doesn't need American conservatives to call him cool and make like Trump Putin 2024 apparel. And he probably knows that would even hurt Donald Trump. He doesn't want to do that. I mean, he mentions that he had a good relationship with Donald Trump, would certainly prefer him getting back into office than, another Biden term. So there's no need to go there. His job as the head of the Russian state is made easier by putting pressure on Western political leadership to discontinue this war. And he achieves this by using one of their favorite media figures to become a medium of delivering this information about the war that they largely don't have. And they don't have it because, as he states in the interview, you're not going to win a propaganda war against the United States. And you don't necessarily even need to win the propaganda war, but maybe it's worth your time to send a submarine into their territory, which is why he took the 2 hours to do this interview with Tucker Carlson. I mean, do you think he didn't have a plan? Do you think he didn't have some sort of objective for this? Do you think he just owed Tucker Carlson a favor or something? That's why he did it? Look at Putin's demeanor. Look at the way that he plays with Tucker Carlson. The guy is totally unfazed. He doesn't give a damn about anything. He holds all the cards and he's aware of it. I mean, he provided a complete dossier of information to relatively intelligent people, tens of millions of them, plus the hundreds of millions of people throughout the world who saw this intelligence and this presentation, this collected demeanor. And I know that Western media outlets have to claim that the interview was actually a failure for Putin, and these anonymous sources are saying that even he knows it's a failure. Look, Putin doesn't care about winning some sort of ideological war against the West. He's not going to get on air and recite statistics about post-op quality of life for gender nonconforming individuals. That's not his game. And he doesn't necessarily want to give the American right their talking points on a platter, risk potentially improving our political machine, even if only marginally. Because as he says, his track record with dealing with American leadership is not good. He understands the mistakes that they've made. He understands the bet that they've made for their country. And as he gets into later, I mean, he knows that really all he has to do, in his view, is just step out of the way and let it happen. Never interrupts your enemy when they're making a mistake. Don't stop them. Don't even say anything. Just let it happen. I mean, he's got nothing to prove at this point. He almost seemed to enjoy toying with Tucker Carlson at some points. He knows he has all the power. He knows he has all the leverage. He doesn't have to appeal to Western sympathies. He doesn't have to appeal to right-wing sympathies. He's doing just fine. He's doing okay. And that's why he's totally free to just spurg out about 9th century Russian history. The guy does not give a f***. I mean, he dwells in worlds that we could never comprehend. The things that this guy knows about how the world works, how that affects our country, how that affects his country, the positions that we're all in. I mean, he probably thought the interview was cute, honestly, but why grant it? Why take the time to do that when he's running a country, when he's fighting a war? I mean, I think he knew that even if Tucker's not as traditionally sophisticated as he may expect, he understood Tucker's reputation. I think he knew it would be relatively fair. But even then, I mean, he's doing fine. He doesn't need to grant the interview. I honestly could even see it just being because he thought it would be funny to stir the pot. I mean, he looks like he's got a good sense of humor. He's clearly autistic. But overall, it did seem to be a sincere, smart appeal to the more intelligent cells that may remain in our power structure, even a few in number, urging cooperation, making a case for some sort of mutual benefit, but most importantly, adding that pressure to U.S. leadership during an election cycle. Russia doesn't need the U.S. to do anything, in its view. In its view, our trajectory is more or less established, as he said. But it would certainly be easier for them if we stopped sending money to Ukraine and weaponizing the dollar, etc., and the war would be over in a few weeks. Putin doesn't care about appealing to the masses. He understands how the American system works. I mean, he even said as much, that you're never going to win a propaganda war against the United States. So what interest does he have trying to deliberately appeal to the citizens of our country, even ignoring that he understands this sort of bottom-up awakening of the people? That's in itself propaganda and not actually how change occurs. If he wanted to appeal to the masses, if he wanted to get the people on his side, he could have spoken in English. But he didn't. If anyone, he's trying to appeal to whatever remnants of common sense and intelligence are still left within our governments. That's his target audience. Like, we might get something out of it, but it's really not for us so much. Even the level of intelligence in his speech, like, it's not just an insult to Tucker to go on this monologue. It's not just a power move. It's an insult and a power move against America by extension. It's anti-democratic. It's actually an insult to the American system, because we can't do that in this country, because we have to appeal to the lowest common denominator at all times. So even if we had leaders who were capable of speaking like that, they couldn't do it. So everybody who Putin would like to know this information, if they didn't already have it, now they do. We learned about the historical case. We learned about the coup in 2014, the actions of the militias in Ukraine. We learned about the NATO expansion despite promises from the United States. We learned about Russia being falsely led on by various presidents about a possibility of joining NATO. We learned about U.S. support for Russian domestic terrorists, the Caucasus separatists. We learned about the creation of this missile defense system under the guise of mitigating Iranian aggression, in which deliberately excluded Russia even after we led them to believe that we wouldn't. We learn about more broken promises pertaining to Ukraine membership in NATO. So there's all of this pressure on Russia. And yeah, the history makes it seem justified and also diminishes the appearance of, the threat to simply like a formality, like, oh yeah, NATO probably shouldn't be there. I guess we'll launch this operation. But the cause of that ultimately is that pressure from the U.S., which has left Russia with little choice but to act to defend from what it reasonably believes to be a threat to its sovereignty and its national security, and to align itself then with China, because the U.S. has given it no reason, literally no reason, to believe that it has any interest in cooperation. And all of that information being delivered to people, the people that it was at the time with the election going on, hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine, lives, like, that's a strategic move by Putin. Whatever the results may be, 2 hours of this time was decided to be a worthy investment. And this was not supposed to happen, by the way, like, not just this conflict with Russia because of Ukraine that we've been involved in and financing for the last 2 years. This whole continued conflict with Russia following the Cold War, that was a choice that was made by our leadership. It would have been beneficial to the United States to integrate Russia into the European Union, NATO, given that they share a border with China. That would have put pressure on the Chinese, being that Russia is more aligned with us rather than them. But instead, we basically backed them into a corner. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we didn't even have to send NATO forces into Eastern Europe to remove Soviet forces. Like, they just went back to Russia voluntarily. And as Putin mentions in this interview, it was thought that Russia would be able to form a relationship with the West following that collapse. There was no remaining obvious clash of interests, no remaining ideological war. We're not natural enemies. So, like, what is this all for? Why not? Russia has far more in common with Europe than it does with China. But instead, the actions of the United States and NATO more or less drove Russia away and into the arms of the Chinese. And I'm not saying that we should have tried to, like, make them into this satellite state of the empire, but the moves that we did take were certainly the wrong ones. And there was clear intent to make an enemy of Russia. Why that is, Putin never really provides an answer in the interview. There are some interesting theories. Maybe we'll get into it a later time. But the point is that this information is tough to argue with. And we've never actually really even heard an argument, just lies and propaganda. Putler was supposed to die of cancer or be assassinated by his inner circle. But instead, everything is pretty much fine. People pretty much love him. He's probably going to win this war, which he's aware of. So, number 3, propaganda. Speaking of propaganda, Tucker Carlson, he asked Vladimir Putin who he thinks blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. Putin says it's obviously America and the CIA, the organization which Tucker Carlson tried to work for. Tucker ignores that, asks if he has proof that it was America. And Putin says he won't get into details, but it wouldn't matter if he did, because you're never going to win a propaganda war with the United States, because the United States controls global media. That is to the benefit largely of American financial interests. And then he says, don't you know that? Again, just toying with Tucker Carlson, just saying it so matter-of-factly, cutting right to the chase, saying what everybody knows is true, especially Tucker, especially Putin. And Tucker asks why NATO would do something like this, if it would harm countries like Germany quite significantly. Why would Germany continue to support this? And Putin says simply that the Germany of today does not act within its national interest, but rather the collective interest of the West, which often hurts Germany directly, but a calculation is made by leadership in DC to just proceed with this anyway. And this is important because it gets people to view the United States as what it is, which is a global empire that is projecting hard and soft power all over the world, and all these other countries are aware of this. They're unfazed by it, and they have made peace with it. Like when Tucker says to Putin that he's clearly very bitter. Putin says, no, he's not bitter. We're not married. There's no emotions involved. This is just the way that things are. That's basically a way of saying, no, I don't think about things like a woman. Because in America, we have this thing called political correctness, which means you have to curate your speech to the emotion of women and effeminate men, like you're crossing this minefield at all times. In America and the West, because they're run as matriarchies, they rely very much on propaganda, on emotional manipulation, cunning, deceptions. So it's no surprise that Tucker's first instinct would be that Putin's just being bitter, and then Putin would respond by basically saying that the way the West conceives of global affairs is very childlike and silly. So moving on, number 4, who's really in charge? Who's really making the decisions in the United States? Tucker asks Putin this question like 5 times. Who's actually pulling the strings? And Putin basically says, I don't know, which I'm sure is just him playing it close to the chest. He can't actually just be like, oh, funny you ask, and start naming names. But he does get into the stories of, having meetings with presidents who tell him one thing and then they go speak to advisors. They come back, they go back on the promises. Presidents, of course, being chief executives, supposedly sovereign over the bureaucracy, over the executive branch. But of course, that's not actually who's in charge. And people like saying that, they like saying, oh, Biden's not actually in charge because he's old and senile, but then they'll say it's Obama or it's Kamala Harris or something. The president isn't actually in charge. The last president to really achieve sovereignty and actually have the power that he's supposed to have was probably like an FDR or a Lincoln, who I'm not fans of, but the point is that Putin is very aware that the entire U.S. government is all just theater. It's all just smoke and mirrors. And if anything, our system actually prefers having someone like Biden in office because then there's no pushback. Everything is just run by the administration. Whereas someone like Obama, they've got an ego, they've got a worldview, he's got a way that he wants things done. That's a tougher operation than having a literal vegetable in office. Because it's like we said forever, decentralized power doesn't actually eliminate or reduce power, but it does eliminate and reduce accountability and all the possibility for serious change. And that's a tough position to be in because it makes the tyranny even more vicious. And world leaders know this. World leaders understand that they have to play the game, go along with the show. They're very aware, though, that when they're dealing with our elected officials and even our presidents, they're basically just dealing with ambassadors. Finally, number 5, the future of U.S. hegemony. When we think of America, we tend to take our status as the apex for granted. I think it's a given. Maybe under Brandon, we're a low number 1. Maybe under Trump, we're a higher number 1, but we're still number 1. That's not a terrible way of viewing things, actually, but there is a serious discussion that we need to have about how our foreign policy has basically been forcing these other countries, top 5 economies, to coalesce in a way that's going to affect the global order going forward. Now, John Doyle is not really concerned about this for reasons that we've discussed, but I can understand how the average American would be concerned with that, maybe even the average GOP voter. And again, it's very matter of fact. Putin's priority is Russia. He's made it clear several times that he's tried to be friends with Europe. They didn't reciprocate. They even did the opposite. Okay, fine. He's not concerned with that. He's content being forever rivals. He's confident in the Chinese economy, the Indian economy, BRICS versus G7, etc. He's not confident in the US dollar. He cites metrics that would suggest that the Chinese economy actually overtook ours long time ago, and also that he's not threatened by, as Tucker said, trading US dominance for Chinese dominance, because he understands that China does not have and has never really had this sort of aggressive, imperially oriented foreign policy. They've shared a border for centuries. They've gotten along well enough. It's not a problem. And that's because the actions taken by the United States leadership, the pressure that they've put onto these other countries, it's caused them to lower their dollar reserves. They're maneuvering to further cooperate in trade and generally align themselves against the West. Fewer transactions are being done with dollars. And this is not good for the United States, because if we lose the power of the dollar, we're going to lose our global power as we currently understand it. We're not run by competent people anymore. The people who run our country, they are significantly less competent than the people who built up and transformed our political system into what it is today. Those people basically handed like an AK-47 to a chimpanzee. And now the U.S. is losing leverage. It's been happening. And instead of adapting to these circumstances, it's instead trying to leverage military and economic power to get other countries to fall in line. And Tucker keeps asking him why he thinks the United States is doing this. And he keeps saying, I don't know, ask your leaders. And again, he's not here to save us. He's not here to give us our talking points, unless it's going to be talking points that make his life easier by putting pressure onto our political leadership to stop funding the other side of the war that he's fighting. He just doesn't care. Like, he's not here to say, hey guys, look at me. Look, I'm reasonable. Support Mother Russia. Haha. Soviet Russia. We ride bear. Haha. No, he's saying, like, here's what's happening. here's what we're doing, and that's it. Like, if anything, pandering to Western audiences would have appeared desperate. Like, he presented himself as very confident in his positions. And if I had seen him sit down with Tucker Carlson and start talking about woke Hollywood and Bud Light, I'd have thought, like, shit, we're going to take Moscow, aren't we? But he didn't, because he doesn't have to. He knows that he's in a good position. He says, here's what's happening, and it's because of your choices, and here's how we're responding. I mean, he knows that if things continue as they've been going, U.S., NATO influence, like, that's going to keep decreasing, and the United States is going to be in trouble. And the Russian president is presenting all of this as matter of fact. He's unfazed by it. He's almost disinterested, even. And our leadership hasn't cared to provide any sort of refutation to any of this beyond calling him Adolf Hitler. Is everything he said true and accurate? Not exactly. Are all of his predictions solid? No, not really. But as he says, we've got, border problems, migration problems. We're over $30 trillion in debt. Like, what the hell are you doing sending money to Ukraine? Don't we have better things to be doing with our country? And it's true. I mean, we have to look inward. We have to put pressure onto our own political leadership, since it's their fault that things are going how they've been going. It's not Russia. It's not China. It's not Iran. It's all because of the swamp. I mean, they chose open borders literally as a matter of policy, inflation as a matter of policy. These were intentional political decisions, and we have to clean house. So I'm glad that Americans could see what a competent, serious statesman looks like. It's certainly not a bad thing. He delivered some good information. A lot of it happens to be true, and it's information that we need. It's information that we benefit from tens of millions of people being exposed to. Not just the masses, not just GOP voters. He could have gone to Fox for that, but people who are working in politics, people who are online enough to be monitoring Twitter, people who are working for congressmen, people who are working for senators, writing for the biggest talking heads, etc. Like, that is not nothing, It doesn't mean it's going to be some big moment of mass realignment. Doesn't mean it's even going to be remembered as like one of the great interviews, maybe, depending on how things go from here. But it is good. It could be. And it's also good that Tucker Carlson landed this, because he's certainly not the only journalist who's been trying to interview Putin. And it's good for us that Tucker was the one who did it, because the guy's just maxing out the stats. I mean, in terms of how good he is on the issues to how popular he is, I mean, there's just no comparison. For a minute there, I was seeing some of the interviews he was doing on Twitter, and I was like, okay, I don't really know what's going on here, but I'm glad that I didn't sell. I'm glad I trusted the plan, because it's objectively good for us to have a guy like Tucker Carlson at the level that he's at, saying the things that he's saying, and now conducting interviews with the most powerful people in the world. Trump, Putin, like, who knows what's next? So even if the whole thing was just for Tucker's resume, even that's a win for us. Moreover, insofar as it has potential to move our people into better positions, make the discourse more accurate, more intelligent, put pressure on Western political leadership as they continue to work towards escalating this conflict into like some mass catastrophe. You thought we got killed after World War II. Imagine a third European war. So then it's good. Just for that alone, it's good. So I'm glad it happened. Was it perfect? No. That's what I'm here for, though. I will elevate the messaging to the standards that you deserve, okay? Big announcement this week.
Put on notice, if you fuck around with us, if you do something bad to us, we are going to do things to you that have never been done before.
The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer. 2024 is our final battle. They stole our jobs and they plundered our wealth. The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots.
Activation word, Ronald McDonald.
We will drive out the globalists.
All patriots go.
We will cast out the communists. America will start winning again. Winning like never before. We will bring back our jobs. We will bring back our borders. And we will bring back